Welcome. My name is Father Peter John Cameron. Happy Easter. We're very happy that you're here. In the summer of 2010, I traveled to Poland to give a workshop, and I asked my host if, while I was there, it might be possible for me to visit Auschwitz. He arranged the visit, and we went. It was a harrowing experience. The visit concluded with a tour of the second concentration camp that is very close by, Birkenau. That camp contains what was originally called the International Monument to the Victims of Fascism. Unveiled in 1967, it bears a plaque that, in a number of different languages, declares, "Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity, where the Nazis murdered about 1.5 million men, women, and children." I was stunned by this. A warning to humanity, yes. But isn't there something more than a cry of despair? If we stop there, if we stop at that, then life itself becomes impossible. We need a different kind of cry. From the years 2009 to 2014, I was the weekend associate priest at St. Rose of Lima Church in Newtown, Connecticut. On the morning of December 14th, 2012, a friend of mine called my cell phone to tell me that a shooting had taken place at the nearby Sandy Hook Elementary School. I immediately drove to St. Rose of Lima, and I was there for the impromptu mass held in the church that evening, which about 2,000 people attended. The horror of that ignominious day came flooding back this past February 14th, when a shooter killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, and again today, when just a few hours ago, a shooter opened fire at the YouTube headquarters in San Bruno, California. And with it came questions. The organizers of tonight's Crossroads Cultural Center event have addressed them this way. Deep down, we know that such problems are not easily solvable because evil cannot be completely eradicated. Therefore, in front of evil, an especially urgent and real question is, how can we live with what has already happened? There are some people who cannot evade this question and cannot take refuge in the endless debates about what to do. They are those who have been directly hit by senseless violence. Not only do we need to look at them in order to learn how it is possible to go on living in the face of atrocity, but paradoxically, they may also be the ones who can think most clearly about what can be done. For the simple reason that the experience of a great suffering makes them painfully aware of reality in all its complexity and depth. Some of you will recall the alarm that gripped our country between the years 1978 and 1995, when the terrorist known as the Unabomber carried out a nationwide bombing spree by way of the U.S. postal system, which targeted academics and technology experts. He killed 3 people and he wounded 23 others, including Yale University professor David Gelernter. Upon recuperating from a nearly fatal mail bombing, he wrote this: "Although I was hurt permanently and will never get back a normal right hand or right eye, although my chest will always look like a gouged out construction site, here is the main thing. I recovered. In some ways, I am better than before. If you insert into this weird slot machine of modern life one evil act, 1,000 acts of kindness tumble out." Flashing back to 2010, as I stood there in the Nazi concentration camp, reading the plaque on the Birkenau Memorial, feeling pretty depressed, I looked up and I saw something I will never forget. It was a priest who had with him a group of young people. They were all gathered around him, and the priest was getting ready to do something. He was preparing to celebrate Mass, right there in the concentration camp, in that place of unspeakable hatred and barbarity. And I thought, yes, that is a better cry, a cry that begs for a presence. Tonight we are blessed with the tremendous honor of having with us two extraordinary women, my friends, who are here to help us cry out for that presence. We are honored to have with us Jennifer Hubbard. Jennifer's youngest child, Catherine Violet, was a victim of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Jennifer and her husband Matthew established the Catherine Violet Hubbard Foundation in their daughter's memory. The foundation is currently building the Catherine Violet Hubbard Animal Sanctuary in Newtown, Connecticut. Jennifer currently serves as chair and president of the sanctuary. She is a monthly contributor to Magnificat, one of Magnificat's truly best-loved authors, and she's the recipient of the 2014 and 2015 Catholic Press Awards. She resides in Sandy Hook with her husband and her son, Frederick. 1 month after the Sandy Hook school shooting, St. Rose of Lima Church put together a series of talks for the parents in the religious education program. As you can imagine, it was a tremendously fearful, agonizing, and anxiety-ridden time. The point of the program was to help the children and the parents make the transition back to school as peacefully as possible. When Jennifer Hubbard learned that the parish was going to hold this gathering, she did something that no one ever expected. She decided on her own that she wanted to come in person and speak to the assembled parents. I was asked to moderate the session. In preparation for it, I called Jenny on the phone. And during the conversation, I asked her how it was ever possible for her to do something that most of the world would consider completely impossible to do. And Jenny responded by saying, "There is a presence that is so much better than us, and we have to acknowledge it." When the day arrived, as she stood in the pulpit of St. Rose of Lima and addressed the church full of parents, what she said and the way she said it was utterly amazing. It was, as I told her afterwards, like listening to St. Catherine of Siena speak. You will see for yourselves shortly. And we are deeply honored to have with us Dawn Ford. Dawn Ford was born and raised in Danbury, Connecticut. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the State University of New York at Brockport. Early in her career, she worked in the fields of chemistry and environmental science. After the birth of her 3 children, she pursued a master's degree in teaching from Sacred Heart University. She taught 2nd grade for 10 years at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. For the past 4 years, Dawn has been teaching 6th grade math and science at Reed Intermediate School, also in Newtown. Dawn has been married for 33 years to Steve, who's here, and she and her husband have called Newtown their home for the past 28 years. The story that Dawn is going to tell you tonight is one that you have never heard before because it has never been disclosed to the public. You have never seen it on the news. You have never read it in the newspaper. It has never been treated in any of the media. To say that her story is astonishing and exceptional does not come close to the truth of it. We are so grateful that Dawn is here to share it with us. Please welcome now Dawn Ford.
Hi, everybody. If I have to get closer.
Can you hear?
Can you hear?
A little closer.
Oh, gosh. That close?
Yeah.
Okay. As Father Peter said, I have never shared my story publicly before. only my, and I'm very emotional. I'm very emotional all the time. But only my family and close friends have heard my story. I did write things out. I'm going to try not to read it, as Father Peter asked me to just say it. But I might have my security blanket here for me. On the morning of December 14th, 2012, I had a meeting scheduled first thing in the morning, and it was a meeting for a student. The meeting included the parent of the student and several staff members. It was to begin at 9:30. I walked in about 9:33 after having briefed my sub on the morning math plans, and no sooner did I sit down at the table than our school psychologist opened the meeting. And she asked to hear first from the classroom teacher. As I opened my mouth to speak, there was a popping sound, abrupt, sudden 3 pops. To me, it sounded like chairs, like a stack of chairs maybe cascading to the ground. And I thought maybe the custodians were setting up something in the cafeteria and something went wrong. But the school principal, Dawn, the school psychologist, Mary, and our lead teacher, Natalie, all stood. Dawn and I looked at each other as Dawn said, what was that? And the 3 of them left the room. As soon as they entered the hallway, there was a barrage of gunfire, which at the time we didn't understand. I thought it was fireworks. I didn't have anything in my experience that would suggest that that's what was happening. But as instinct, we just split to the 4 corners of the room. There were 8 of us, or 9 of us originally in the room, and there were 6 of us remaining, and we split to the 4 corners of the room. And what we heard in the next several minutes would be a barrage of gunfire, followed by silence, momentary silence, followed by more gunfire. In one of the momentary silences, Natalie, our lead teacher, came back into the room. She was hopping on 1 foot because one side of her body had been shot. Her hand, her foot, her leg. She quietly slipped into the room and she pressed her body against the front wall, and she held our unlocked door closed with her other hand. And the gunfire erupted again. And in the next silence, somebody whispered, we have to call for help. Does anybody have a phone? And at that time, there was 1 cell phone in the room, and it was in the parents' purse, which was on the desk, which was in direct vision of the window to our conference room. So we didn't, dare to make a move for the purse. But there was a phone hanging on the wall, and if I stood, I could reach the phone, but I didn't want to be that visible. So from my corner, I just reached up and I batted the receiver off the hook and just let it dangle. And I reached up to jab at the code to get an outside line. There were a couple of series of numbers that you had to hit to get an outside line so that I could then reach 911. And I hit the first series of numbers. I heard the dial tone. And as I reached up to hit the second number, the gunfire erupted again. So I just retreated back to my corner. After a time, some silence came again, and it seemed longer this time. And we thought that maybe whatever was happening out there was over. but we didn't dare move from the room. It was at this point, I believe, that people heard sirens. I never heard any sirens. People smelled gunpowder. I don't have any recollection of smelling gunpowder. But we got a sense of hushed movement in the hallway, and we figured it was probably help. Someone said we need to pray and began reciting the Our Father. I, at this point, crawled from my spot in the corner to Natalie, who was still holding the door for us, holding the door closed. And I slipped my knees underneath her head so she could rest her head, and I replaced my hand with hers on the door. And another woman who was in the other corner came in to Natalie's feet and was just stroking her and soothing her. She was obviously very scared, and she was hurt. And we just reassured her she was going to be okay. And the time waiting seemed endless. And like I said, we knew there was movement outside of our door. And so at one point I opened the door a crack and yelled out, "Somebody's hurt in here." But my coworker said, "Close the door and don't say anything again." And but finally the police carefully opened our door, and they took Natalie to a waiting ambulance, but they asked the rest of us to stay put because I believe at that time they weren't sure if there were more than one perpetrator. So at this point in time, we figured it was safe to move around the room, and so I handed the parent her purse. She took out her cell phone and made her call and passed around the phone so that we can all make our calls. I called my husband Steve, whose shop was right down the street. I told him that there were multiple gunshots fired from inside of our school. And I was worried about our son Ben, who was 22 at the time, and he is a boy, a young man with autism. He worked at the school, in the school library. And I just remember thinking about him and hoping he'd be able to stay quiet. I was afraid he would draw attention to himself. But the ladies that he worked with in the library later told me that they led him to a closet in the supply room of the library, and he was silent. He silently followed their directions, and in the closet he found a bag of stuffed animals, and he pulled each one out and surrounded himself in quiet comfort. And I was very grateful for that. Once we were able to leave our room, we walked past Mary and Dawn, who were lying in the hall. And I remember thinking, why isn't anybody helping them? You know, they helped Natalie, why isn't anybody helping them? Because it was just still shocking, and I wasn't even really fully understanding what was happening, and the realization that they couldn't be helped came later. Exiting the building, we walked over the shattered glass that was once our entry room door. Once outside, we were directed to go to the firehouse at the end of our driveway, which was our evacuation location, but I just paced the parking lot because I couldn't leave. I didn't know where my second grade class was. I didn't know where my son was. And Steve, my husband, arrived on the scene pretty quick before most of the first responders, and we found each other in the parking lot. And he said, "You find your class and I'll find Ben." So I headed back to the building, but I was stopped at a certain point, and they wouldn't let me past a certain point, and so I waited, and finally my class emerged, led by the building sub, Kathleen, a young woman who I'll forever be grateful to for the way she took care of my class that day. In the weeks that followed, once the investigation was completed, the police did a debriefing at our school for the staff before they released their full investigation to the public. And among one of the details that they gave us was the fact that the one event that saved the most lives that day was the fact that the PA system had been opened up, and so that the gunfire was broadcast throughout the school. And although this was distressing for all of the students and the staff to hear, it alerted people that something was happening, and it alerted them to go into lockdown. And if they hadn't heard that broadcast over the intercom, kids may have been walking to the office with notes, people may have been passing in the halls, teachers may have been trying to find out what the commotion was in front of the school. So the lieutenant in charge of the investigation added that the remarkable part of this detail was that the PA system was only, it was activated by the phone that was left off the hook in the conference room. And the amazing part of that was that the telephone company who installed the PA system and the intercom system said that the only phone that was wired to broadcast throughout the school was in the office. And no other phone was wired to do that. So at this debriefing, people were confused, and they said, what are you saying? Like, how then is that possible? You know, they said, are you saying it was an act of God? And the lieutenant just pretty much shrugged his shoulders, and he had no other explanation. So although I still can't comprehend the question, why does God allow this to happen? I feel that, you know, although he didn't or couldn't control the one man's act of free will, I believe the answer to the question of where was God that day is that he was there. I believe he was there to lift the 26 souls straight to heaven. And I believe he was there for those of us who survived. So the rest of my story is about hope. I mean, that was about hope as well. But in the aftermath, there was a huge outpouring of support from all over the country and really all over the world, I'm sure. And I'll just name a few examples that were, everything that happened was very significant, but a few very significant examples. One was the gift of the school that we were given, the temporary location by a neighboring town, the town of Monroe, who had an empty middle school that they allowed us to occupy for as long as we needed it until a new school was built. And this was significant because there was talk about, you know, where are we going to put everybody for the rest of the school year? We couldn't go back to Sandy Hook School. And so they were talking about dividing us up into office space here, retail space there. So the fact that we were given a whole school where we could go and be together as a school community was significant. And another moving part of that story was over the winter break, we went in, all of our, materials were moved, by the custodians and things, boxed up and moved. But when we arrived at that school to set up our classrooms for our students to return after the first of the year, we went into the school and we found that there were so many people already there. There were people from our Newtown School District, other schools in our school district. There were people from Monroe. Their children were there, their neighbors and friends. And they were decorating that middle school for elementary school children. They were making bulletin boards with snow scenes and gingerbread houses and Candyland, and I remember, walking in and encountering these people cheerily spending their time, which was their rest time, it was their family time, it was their holiday time. And they were there making a school for us and our kids. And I was overwhelmed with gratitude for that. There was a lot of hugging of strangers in those days. For a long time. So support came in many forms other than the actual building. We were inundated with gifts from all over. For teachers, there were prayer shawls and jewelry and meals and salon services and on and on. And for kids, there were stuffed animals and toys and school supplies and tickets to sporting events and shows and all kinds of things. And although I was appreciative and grateful and understood where people were coming from who sent these things, because it was from a place of compassion and helplessness and wanting to do something. The things offered little comfort. But what did help were the notes, because in addition to the things, we got notes and prayers, letters, cards from educators, from students, and from the general public, offering their condolences, their thoughts, and their wishes for healing. And these thoughts and prayers, whether they were spoken or unspoken, along with the direct support of my family and my friends, filled me with a sense of calm and peace, even though my heart was broken. I didn't feel alone. And again, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the support from my family and my friends and from people who I would never, ever meet. So, in response to a horrific tragedy like the one that we experienced and like the one that recently happened in Parkland, there's an overwhelming sense that some sort of action must be taken. And I felt this almost immediately. What am I supposed to do? Besides the obvious. And the obvious was take care of my family. I mean, it was 2 weeks before Christmas. And we don't put up our Christmas tree after Thanksgiving. I didn't have a Christmas tree. I had to take care of my family. I had to make a Christmas for my family and enjoy my friends, and I had to teach my students And so that's what I did. But these questions still have bothered me for the past 5 years. Some people right away focused on political action, school safety and gun control, etc. There were many foundations and organizations that were started, much like Jenny's foundation for Catherine. Other foundations that were already in existence came to our area, like the Life is Good Kids Foundation, which focuses on optimism, and Ben's Bells, which focuses on kindness, spreading kindness. And although I haven't yet committed to being a member of any foundation, I've always gravitated towards the ones that were, you know, focused on optimism and kindness and a sense of community belonging. And I mentioned that my son, Ben, has autism. He's now almost 28 years old. He has 4 jobs in our community, including his job at Sandy Hook School, which he still holds today. I moved on, but he decided to stay at Sandy Hook. But Ben is lucky in many ways. He has a group of friends that he has been involved with since his elementary school years. And they get together regularly once a week to either go out to eat or to go bowling. They make their own plans these days. He belongs to a couple of different social groups, you know, groups that go out to dinner once a month, or another group that meets at our local youth center once a month. He is a member of our local gym. He goes there a couple times a month. He swims at the high school pool. So he's an active member of our community. But he also spends an awful lot of time in front of screens. He plays a lot of video games, and he watches a lot of YouTube. And left to his own devices, he would spend the majority of his time, if not all of his time, closed in his room on screens, video games, and YouTube. So without that community involvement that he has, it would be very, very easy for him to be disconnected from people. Unfortunately, there are many people, marginalized people, and I would put people with developmental disabilities in that group, who aren't as lucky as Ben. Ben's fortunate because he has a community of people who care about him and involve him and have taken the time and taken a chance on him to hire him for a job, to include him in the community, to make him feel welcome. Ben and others like him often can't advocate for themselves. They can't even drive themselves. So sometimes it's as simple as, you know, taking him somewhere, you know, offering a ride, because he can't get himself anywhere. It doesn't, what I want to say too is that it doesn't even have to involve fancy expensive programs or buildings to be built, although that's something that our family is working on, because that's also necessary, that there is programming for adults with special needs that we take such good care of in the school system. But once they reach 21, there really isn't a whole lot for them unless they have people to care and people who will advocate for them and pull them out of isolation. So, all of Ben's activities, I wanted to say, are just like these organic, homegrown activities that are just because, you know, my mom cared enough to take over a social group that, you know, organizing dinners, you know, with, and this is a local group of area towns There are young adults from maybe 3, 4 area towns that get together once a month for a dinner. And, you know, the teen center that then goes to, and, you know, just other activities that involves people saying, you know, yes, you know, we'll let your young adults use the teen center. The teens aren't using it, you know. So it just takes talking to people and people being open-minded. So going back to my original questions about why am I still here, what am I supposed to do? I still struggle with these questions, but I'm beginning to wonder if that something that I'm supposed to do isn't something new or big or different, but maybe it's just to continue to do the obvious, which is to take care of my family and my friends and my students, and to maybe encourage others to reach out and help people like my son who, without community involvement, couldn't otherwise help themselves.
For Hubbard.
You're a hard act to follow.
No.
So I know Ben. Ben worked at the library with me, and he's an extraordinary human being. And now that I've met his parents, I know why he is an extraordinary human being. You see, I had 2 kids at Sandy Hook, Catherine and Freddie, and because of Dawn, Freddie still walks this earth. And that's a gift that you've given me that I can't thank you enough for. So the question tonight is, why and how do you continue to live when your life has been touched by an extraordinary evil? And I don't know the answer. And I'll never know the answer. Because you see, on December 13th, my husband was in Switzerland. We were getting excited about him coming home because that weekend in our family was the weekend that we made the gingerbread house and the cookies and decorated the tree and did every other thing that we could possibly squeeze into 2 days so that we would be ready for Christmas. So the night of December 13th, we made gingerbread for the house that we would assemble. And I remember saying to my dad, I made a horrible mess out of the gingerbread, but what an awesome night. And I'm not going to touch it. Because the year before that, I probably would have redone it after the kids went to bed. I put Catherine on the bus. Freddie ran ahead. And for some reason, on December 14th, Catherine didn't cry. Every single walk to the bus stop included Catherine crying, saying that she didn't want to go to school. She wanted to stay home with Mama. And I remember crying on the way home from the bus stop because my neighbor said, Catherine's doing extraordinary. And I said, she is. I think she's going to make it. A few hours later, I received the phone call. And I drove to the firehouse. And I called my mom and my dad. And I didn't want to bother Matt because he was overseas getting ready to make the journey home. And I didn't know what had happened. And when I arrived at the firehouse, I was met by my son, who started crying and said he couldn't find her. You see, there's a sense of responsibility that our little ones take seriously. Because when his dad left for Switzerland, he told him he was responsible now. And so when he couldn't find his little redhead sister, he was upset. We spent the next 3.5 to 4 hours in the firehouse, and I prayed. I prayed that God would bring Catherine out of that firehouse. And in so many ways, I can tell you tonight, he did. He answered my prayer. And I will never understand why Catherine didn't come home, but I will always know that Catherine is home. Because Catherine went to heaven. And so we started the arduous task on December 14th of living life in a new normal, in a new way. And I'd love to tell you that my faith was strong and that I was where I am now, and I in no way, shape, or form was. You see, I'd been growing in my faith up until that point. Catherine had a little friend whose mother grew up Baptist and was telling me about a God for 3 years before the girls died. Told me about a God who loved her and that I should lay everything at his feet. And I didn't understand. But over the course of 3 years before Catherine died, God was drawing me in. And he was teaching me how I would lay things at his feet. And what I can tell you is that over the past 5.5 years, the epiphany that I was bound and determined was going to happen has never happened. The clouds haven't parted, the skies haven't opened, God hasn't told me directly what I need to do, God hasn't answered my prayers directly. But God has spoken, and God has been in my life. And God has been real to me in 3 ways. And so how do we live in the aftermath of losing our baby? We trust in 3 of his promises. And I'd like to share 3 of those ways. First is God will protect always. He protected Catherine. He protects Freddie. He protects my broken heart. God provides. He provides ways and opportunities, people and experiences, moments that now my eyes are open to, because you see, those are the epiphanies. And God heals. Regardless what the cross is, regardless of what our brokenness is, God swoops right into those places. And God heals. So back to December 15th. We were told we had to write an obituary, and that we needed to plan a funeral, and we had to go buy a coffin, and we had to call family, and we had to do everything that I had never dreamed I'd be doing. You see, Catherine was glorious, and she was going to make it. So I don't remember a whole lot of those days, except for the fact that I had to, at her funeral, read the following reading. So I'll read it to you. You probably all know it. It goes something like this. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they will comfort me. Catherine loved animals. And so on her mass card, it's Jesus holding the lamb. And Psalm 23. And what I did not know then that I do know now is that that reading was not for Catherine, and that card was not for Catherine. That card and that reading was for me. Because God has walked me through the darkest valleys. And He has protected me so that I can protect my son. You see, we waited as a family for weeks and weeks until we realized that at some point school was going to be back in session and we would need to make a decision. There's an unfortunate part of who we are as a society. We justify everything. And so it was understandable, even encouraged. If Freddie didn't have to get on the bus, he could go to school late, he could be shuttled in through a back door, he didn't even have to go at all. And it was understood, even expected. And we decided that that was not at all the case. If we were going to walk this new normal and we were going to live in a trust, whether we knew what that looked like or not, that we needed to start with our example to our son. And so we walked him down to the bus stop, and we put him on the bus, and we never said, "You'll be fine," because we didn't know. And we didn't say, "You're going to have a great day," because it was an 8-year-old and his sister tragically died. And it's not a great day. But what we did say to him was, "We'll see you when you get home." And you know, I didn't know what I was saying then, but I know now that I was keeping a promise, because in our house, a promise is a promise is a promise, and will always be a promise. And if I didn't see him when he came home that day, I would see him when I got home, my heavenly home, where Catherine is, and where he'll be, and where we will all be at some point in time. So we put him on the bus, and we held it together until we could turn around and start the trek back up to the house, where once again I was crying, and my husband was crying. And we got home, and he looked at me and he said, "If that kid can go to school, then I can go to work." And it was the first day that we started walking in a faith of a protected heart and a new normal. You know, the other piece of advice that I was given is go back to bed. You've earned the right, you can go back to bed. But when you've gotten up in the morning and you've packed a lunchbox and you put your kid on the bus and your husband's gone to school, you don't go back to bed. And so I did what I knew to do. And so I sat at my kitchen table and I cracked open my Bible and I started reading. Because what else do you do? Like, the house isn't messy anymore because there's only 3 of us. And my kid's at school, so I started reading the Bible. And pretty soon, I realized that those were the words that God would guide me and provide direction for the next steps that we would take. You see, God provides what we need to move forward. In those days, I was asking what I needed to do. What was next? I think it was a question in Newtown. What do I do? And I just needed to be a mom. I had an 8-year-old that needed me. And I needed to be a wife. I had a husband who needed me. And we needed to figure out what the next steps were. And so at night, we would not read the AR books that came home in the little pouch. Because when you have 2 kids, you're able to split the difference. And one of us would end up in the family room while the other one of us was reading with Freddie. And so we decided to scrap the AR books. And I cracked open a Bible. It was called the Action Bible. And Freddie and I would pore through the pages. And before too long, I started getting answers to questions because things started lining up for me. You see, we had started building the Catherine Violet Hubbard Animal Sanctuary. Catherine loved animals. And we needed to answer some pretty significant questions for the next steps. And I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know what I was doing. On December 13th, I was a mom with 2 kids, worried about burnt gingerbread. And now all of a sudden, I was building an animal sanctuary that I had no idea what it meant or how it looked. But God did. And He provided the answers. In those nights of reading with Freddie and the mornings of reading at my kitchen table, I learned about this person called Moses. And my journals started getting filled with questions about who Moses, why Moses, what am I supposed to know about Moses? Is it the ark? Is it the ark God? Because this is really cool. And I never really got an answer until I sat in my architect's office. And we were talking about a drive that was a pretty contentious conversation in town. And the architects asked us, what tree did Catherine love? And Matt and I bantered back and forth about the tree that she thought was the grand oak from California, and she would climb to the top of it and pretend that she was a monkey. And in the fall, it would turn a bright, bright red. So we described it, and we assured the architects it was not a great oak. It was actually really tiny, but it was really big in comparison to Catherine. And he looked at us, and he said, I think you're talking about a burning bush. And I started crying. And I said, I think you're right. And I decided at that point it was time for me to get out of the way. Because God was going to provide all of the answers that we needed to do. I didn't need to stress out about whether or not my son was okay. I didn't need to stress out over whether or not the sanctuary would be built or whether or not I would be a colossal failure. You see, God provides the way. He provided time for me to be a mom in this new normal of 3 when we were very comfortable being 4. And God provided a way for how I would fill my days and the answers for when I would question. But the one thing that I do know is that whether I want to believe it or not, God will heal. Because He continues to heal in the everyday little moments of this world. Before I had kids, I was in corporate America. I worked in Midtown. I took the train every day. Matt and I lived a life that we thought was grandiose. And we were moved to Buffalo, New York, because my husband and I made a deal. He would never go south of Mason-Dixon. And so when it was time to move, we were either going to Nashville, San Francisco, or Buffalo. And we went to Buffalo. And when I had my son, he was whisked off to the NICU. And I made a deal with God that if He brought him home from the NICU, I would slow it down. And you see, a promise is a promise. It's always a promise. So I slowed it down, and I stopped working. And we decided to move to the most expensive county in the East Coast, or if not the country. We barely had a foot in Newtown. And I spent 6 years with my kids. Catherine was born less than 2 years after Freddie was born. We had nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was no tumble jungle or bounce houses. It was the yard, a swing set, a sandbox, and their imaginations. And those 6 years were the best 6 years of my life. Because in those moments of being with my kids and having nothing, I saw the world through their eyes. And it is through those moments that I am healed and urged to move forward. God's creation is glorious. And the simple things, like the bundles of daffodils that she would insist on pulling out of the ground, roots and all, and bringing them into the house, while infuriating when Catherine was here, are now the comfort that Freddie and I clip around this time of year. You see, there's a shared understanding of it's going to be okay. And a reminder of the moments that Catherine had with us. She would spot the crocus and she would yell, "Crocus pocus." And this weekend, for the first time in 5.5 years, my husband said to me, "Crocus pocus." You see, his heart's healing too. And it's in those moments where you can acknowledge the one that you miss dearly, by those subtle reminders that you know all will be well. We may not like to hear it, we may not like to live in it, but all will be well, I guarantee you. I call Freddie my brave one because he sat with me at the firehouse and he didn't leave. He was offered multiple opportunities to go home, to be with his grandfather. And he said, "No, I'm staying with Mama." Because I think he knew a promise was a promise and is always a promise. And from that day, we called him our brave one. Eventually, an 8-year-old can't carry the weight of grief. And his crumbling happened Easter of 2014. He'd had it. He couldn't carry it anymore. And he went dark, fast. He stopped going to school. And when he did go to school, he would call me within 10 minutes and say, "Mama, I don't feel good. I'd like to come home." And he'd come home. And I'd say to him, "You have to go to school. You do realize this isn't an option. You have to go to school." And some days I'd get angry with him. And some days we'd sit on the couch. And some days I would shake my fists at God. Until one night where I let God have it. You see, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that God was with me. But I think that I still had a sense that God was a judging God. Whether or not I acknowledged it was a different story. So I sat at the light, going to Stop and Shop. And my husband was back at work, carrying the weight of providing for his family. And my son wasn't going to school. And I thought I had to build a sanctuary, and how on earth was I supposed to build a sanctuary if the kid keeps coming home from school? And at the stoplight, I laid into God. I let God have it. And I told God that I was a faithful daughter. And this was my thanks. And if this was my thanks for sticking by him and for doing what he said and honoring him, why on earth was he taking another child? Because if that's how this deal worked, I was out of here. And I was at a crossroads. Because I was ready to run as far and as fast as I could possibly run. And I screamed a scream that I will never quite understand. And I waited for that big epiphany, for the clouds to part, and this was the moment that God said, enough with you, enough with your temper tantrum, I'm done with you. And he didn't. He didn't. He came into a place where he knew I needed him. And he didn't judge me, and he didn't walk away. He began the process of healing. Healing me, and healing my heart, and helping me move forward in this new normal. In the weeks that followed, Freddie went to the counselor, and he would sit in the corner of her office, and he would rock in a fetal position, and she would talk him through it. And while I don't understand what was happening, I do know that there was a peace about that time. And after the fact, Freddie started bubbling again. He's got these big blue eyes that just sparkle. And one of them's a little bit lazy, and so it looks like he's winking at you. And he started winking again. And we started living life. And there wasn't an epiphany. And there wasn't a moment where God said, okay, all is well, you can start living. It was a slow transformation. I asked Freddie one day, what on earth was going through your mind when you were curled up in a ball because you scared your mama? And he said to me, do you remember that book that we read after Catherine died? I said, yeah. The action book. He said, yeah. Do you remember that story that I loved? I said, yeah. The one about Jesus in the boat? He said, yeah. The one with the waves crashing, and I thought it was a riot that Jesus was sleeping. That one? Yes, that one. He said to me, I felt like I was in the boat. And I felt like the waves were crashing on the boat. You see, around the same time, I was reading the same story. And the waves crashing riddled the pages of my journal. And it was in that conversation with my brave one that I realized that he was God's voice. And that God was saying to me, oh, you of little faith. I was right there. And I am right there. And I'm not sleeping. And I'm not going to let you get hurt. There's waves and there's storms. And I know in this journey that we walk, it is not a one and done deal. Just because I lost Catherine doesn't mean that I'm not going to face trials and hardships. We already have. The difference is that we hold God to the promises that he gave us. Because if a promise is a promise for us, a promise is a promise for God, and he delivers. And with each trial and with each tribulation, he provides, he protects us, and he heals us. And what I'm realizing is that he's drawing us closer each and every time. So the question of how do you go on living when your life has been touched by something as horrific as having your daughter murdered. You trust that God is good for his word. And you trust that God will heal and protect and provide.
We have a little time for some questions, which I'm happy to moderate. Yes.
Good evening. First off, thank you very much for sharing your stories of courage and allowing us to participate in your process of healing. I'm a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm also a vice principal in a high school. I lived through 9/11. Came over on 9/11 to help out. I've done a lot of work and studies on Columbine and met with Frank DeAngelis, the principal of Columbine, to try to process evil. In my 4 years, I just was ordained 2 years ago as a deacon. And throughout my studies, I would periodically raise the question, how would you approach those or the families who lost someone or who were a part of Newtown, Connecticut, Sandy Hook? And I can tell you this, even on our last retreat, our brothers got together up in Mara Center in Casabas, New York. I never fully was satisfied with any answer. I think I'm going to walk away tonight with a better sense of comfort of how to try to minister to people who've experienced something so horrific. So my question is first off to you, Father, nothing in my 4 years in preparation at seminary has taught me or given me the words or the actions to go in and minister to families. How did you do it, and do you have any suggestions? And to the ladies, is there, and particularly to Ms. Ford, you had mentioned that the material stuff didn't matter, the notes, but was there anything poignant that stuck out either in the notes or any particular words that really uplifted you? And was there any things that people said that really offended you? Thank you.
I answer first.
Oh, yes.
I can't remember anything that offended me, anything at all. I can't remember specific words that helped. Just knowing that people cared enough to write a note. And as I said, like, you know, when people would say, oh, the world is, you know, praying for you, I believed it. You know what I mean? I really feel like I felt that, you know? And so it wasn't anything in particular. It was just, you know, the gratitude that I felt that somebody took the time, you know, either to put, you know, pen to paper or even just to have a thought. You know, I mean, that alone just, I don't know if it had the same effect on everybody, but that I was very, very grateful and calmed by it.
I don't really know how to answer your question. I'll just tell you what I remember. So this was a few days before Christmas, you know. So, and I had the first Mass of the Sunday following the shooting. And Newtown was a media circus. So when I was driving in from Yonkers, New York, they wouldn't even allow you to get off at exit 10, which is the Newtown exit on Route 84. So I had to get off at an earlier exit and take the back roads to St. Rose of Lima, which was surrounded by lights from, you know, news trucks, etc. And the church had been left open all night long. I got there early because the guy that has a 7 o'clock Mass has to open the church and all that stuff. So it was already open, so I had plenty of time. And there were people there praying, and this one man came up to me and said, well, something to the effect that since this horrible thing happened, Christmas has to be called off this year. I said, no, it's just the opposite. This is why we need Christmas. So that's the only thing that I think, that's the only role that I played, was to insist on the presence of God in the flesh and His Son Jesus Christ in the midst of this unspeakable horror. Because, you know, many people say, well, this event probably really rallied the faith of St. Rose of Lima. And what people don't understand is, St. Rose of Lima is an extremely powerfully faithful place. And, I mean, I say this to you because you're my friends. I think St. Rose of Lima was targeted by the evil one because of its faith. So it wasn't like the people there started living their faith. Rather, this happened, they said, oh, well, this is what our faith is for. And so, I don't really know how to explain it, except that God began to show his face in a way, in the midst of that horror, that created a kind of a newness and a hope that helped other people. There was a story about a newspaper reporter who came to cover the first Vigil Mass, and he got there early, and he was a fallen away Catholic with a story that you can read in 100 different places. And he found Father Ignacio, one of the vicars, parochial vicars, sitting in the cry room to listen to confessions, because that's what we did. We started hearing confessions pretty much around the clock. And the man was converted from speaking to Father Ignacio, who's a beautiful, gentle, young, holy priest. That was one of the first, I think, miracles and fruits of that slaughter, was bringing this man back. So I think the bottom line is to stand before the evil, certain that the evil is not reality, and that the suffering that we experience points us to reality, and reminds us that there's something greater than ourselves that's just waiting for us to open up our arms and to welcome it into our midst. And because what I kept saying in the homilies that I gave was that we have an opportunity here, the people of St. Rose of Lima, to show the world that God is real, simply by not collapsing before this attack. And they didn't. And there are many, many other stories. Jenny Hubbard was the leader of the 8 mothers. There were 8 children's funerals at St. Rose of Lima. And when the other mothers found out that Jenny Hubbard was coming to speak at this program, the other 7 mothers said, well, we want to go too. And they went, right? Because of you. They went. So that's it, I think. It's a certainty in front of a presence that makes that presence more greater than the evil that wants to win but can't. Yes, Sarah.
I was going to say, we had a first grader when that happened, and that just was so, it was just very emotional, and from a parent's perspective, and now I'm a teacher in a public school. I thought, of all the shootings, this one was like really a game changer in the sense that you really had a feeling like nobody's safe anymore, and practically, I could no longer just walk into my kids' school anymore, even though they knew me and they knew that I had 5 kids and that I wasn't going to be harming anyone. There was a new protocol. I had to go around to the front, and I really, it upset me that there was just a whole lack of trust, which had to be in place now because of what happened. And you had to say, that wasn't evil, because you didn't have the access to the teachers anymore in the way that you would have, and the teachers also, there was a mistrust, like the fence went up higher and this and so forth. And like the school where I teach now, the principal, I can honestly say he's obsessed with security and safety. And his wife, coincidentally, is a psychiatrist, and she works on the mental health of the district. And she's obsessed. I've listened to her speak separately about the security, the mental security of these kids that are very fragile. And I want to say, you can't, nobody can protect, in a way. And so what you were saying about the new norm is, you know, there is all the protocols. I'm a special ed teacher, so when the parents come in, they have to be, you know, all the name tags and the this and the that, all the different steps. I check IDs in the morning now, and now I have to make sure the ID's up close to their face so that they are who they say they are, and even though they're maybe my student, it's just, you have to follow all these things. So the question, you know, I reminded again that in the face of this, how can I be free? How can I be joyful and still be welcoming and live the day in a way mindful of what I've met, which is greater, and who accompanies me, which is greater than this evil and this lack of trust.
It's all on you.
You just have to. Like, you have to. For the kids that you're I think about like airports after 9/11. A colossal pain to travel anywhere. But you just have to do it. And I think the transformation comes in who we are in the midst of all the rules and the regulations, and, you know, understanding that there's protocol that needs to be met, but not becoming bogged down with that. I don't know. I wish I had a clear-cut answer. I know that when I send Freddie off, my instinct is to pull him in tighter, but I can't, out of fairness to him. Because Matt and I say to him every single day, you're here for a reason that God created. And you not fulfilling that obligation are denying the world of an incredible blessing. And so we have to figure out how to work within those parameters of safety versus just joy and who we're called to be.
Tim.
Thanks, Father Peter. I have like a million things I want to say and at least 12 questions, but I'll stick with one or two things and ask a question that I have and I have had for a long time. The first thing is my conversion has everything to do with a school shooting. I mean, at Virginia Tech, and after those 30 kids were murdered and everybody was calling it a random act of violence, I just refuse to believe that. I still don't believe in this concept of randomness with these school shootings. And so the first thing I want to say is how thankful I am for you guys giving witness to your experience, the truth of what you saw and what happened. I especially want to thank Mrs. Ford for your honesty and what is a very vulnerable thing to admit. And I don't know if the connection was made by Father Peter in the introduction. I missed it, and I apologize. But, you know, Adam Lanza had autism. Yeah. And no one says what you said. No one talks about the fact that your son has what he needs to have a place. Because our society, we don't think these things are related, but they are. People with disabilities do not have a place. People who do not have the possibility of contributing to society in the way that normal people do, don't have a place. And when they don't have a place, they become isolated. And the crisis of identity in our culture is related. The instability of people with a crisis of identity is related. And because we can't find our place, and as a result, we look for it in the worst places as a result. And I say this because I'm sick of hearing about things being random or being related to inanimate objects that need a person to use them and to inflict danger and harm. I think gun violence is a disaster. I think we should do everything we can to limit access to guns. This is not the problem. But I'm saying, I'm just so thankful for both of you speaking to what happened. And then the second thing I want to say about that is that as a result, I think, you know, with the questions that you have, it's so good that you didn't try to answer them, or that you did and you had to wait and see what happened in time. Because how else are we supposed to understand how God responds if we don't let Him? I mean, we often think that it's a one-way kind of relationship, but you know, at some point He does respond, but how He responds is fascinating, because as we know, things like suffering and evil exist in the world, and the church has spent its entire history trying to understand those things, and it was told by Christ that that's why He came. So, you know, I think it's beautiful to hear what you have said in your experience is the answer to those things, you know, and there's all sorts of things I could say about that, but I'll stop there. And just the question that I have is related to both of those points, which is that, you know, what would you say to those poor kids who just went through this terrible massacre down in Florida, who have been, and this is, you know, I apologize if this offends anybody, really been co-opted by former Mayor Bloomberg and his organization, who has jumped on that train and used them to promote all sorts of important policy that I would support, but that I don't think actually responds to the crisis. Well, what would you say to those kids? I mean, in terms of what it takes for them and their families to respond in a serious way to a problem that society doesn't exist, a randomness that we can't call by name, and that I think the church gives us this responsibility to you know, look in the face and to remain. You know. I would love to know your experience on that.
I think, as I said, like, I think that the school systems, I can speak for Newtown, and I think in general we're getting on board with educating our kids pretty well, even kids with special needs. But again, once they age out of the school system at 21, there's not much. So, I mean, maybe there are agencies that might help them get a part-time job here or there or whatever. So, but other than that, you know, and then they might have a job coach that helps them, you know, a little. But other than that, they're on their own. So I really do think that it is, and starting in high schools and even in middle schools, they have these wonderful programs, Best Buddies, you know, if you're familiar with that, and it carries on into colleges and things too. And Best Buddies is one example where typical students partner up with students with special needs and involve them in all kinds of, you know, community activities. But those things, you know, they're relationships that are forming, and those relationships need to continue. That's the thing, you know. And Ben has this one dear friend, Casey, and Ben and Casey have been friends forever. I mean, I think they were in preschool together, and Ben went to a special needs preschool that also had typical play partners, and so Ben and Casey just, you know, so Casey's typical, and Ben and Casey just gravitated toward each other. So they were together in their preschool years, and then they went to separate elementary schools. They found each other again in middle school, where all the kids come together. And the interesting thing is that years after, you know, Casey, you know, just took a special interest in Ben and took him under her wing. She had a little brother who had autism, you know, and at the time, you know, she didn't, you know. And so anyways, it's now years later, and Ben's, you know, just finally learned how to use, he loves the, you know, like I say, loves all the technology and stuff, but he doesn't love phones because, you know, they ring unexpectedly, you know, he doesn't like unexpected things. But he can put them on silence, and now that he's learned to text, you know, he texts Casey, you know, all the time. And she's a busy lady, but she gets back to him, you know, and so that relationship has continued. And like I say, I mean, his relationship that he's had with his friends that he met back in elementary school, these are, I mean, the original group dubbed themselves as the Fantastic Four, and now there are more of them. But and these are all kids with special needs. But one of them drives, you know, and he doesn't drive out of town. So, I mean, they, you know, they need people, you know, they need other people. So, you know, my daughter is a huge advocate. You know, our daughter who's 23, you know, she's a huge advocate. She's the one who runs the program at the youth center, the teen center, which is the young adult center for our kids. And we're trying to all the time pull in more typical, you know, people, because it's a place where our young adults with special needs can, you know, hang out and, but, you know, and they have each other, which is great, but, you know, they need, some of them will even say, you know, we have a dear friend who will say, I want a boyfriend, but I want a typical boyfriend, you know what I mean? So, you know, people just have to reach out, you know? I mean, sometimes my daughter will just invite her friend, do you want to go to a yoga class? And this friend has been practicing yoga for a long time. She's never been to a yoga class. She's done the DVD, you know, she watches it on TV and she does the moves. And she was delighted, you know, that somebody invited her to a yoga class. And, you know, so that's more of what we need, you know. So, I mean, the message is look around, you know, if there's somebody who, you know, find these people, they're there, you know, and just find a way, you know, to include them, invite them, you know, look into organized, you know, organizations if you have them in your area, or if not, just look around.
Yes.
So I teach religion to high school juniors and seniors, and in front of the last shooting that happened a couple weeks ago, I've been struck by how many students seem extremely apathetic about everything that's been happening. There are times that I have tried to start discussions about it, to ask them, you know, what are their reactions, what are they thinking, and again, like I just see a lot of guys who are just like, oh, it's too bad. But there is a small group of kids who have expressed an interest to get involved in some of the activism that's been going on. I guess what's been initiated by the kids down in Florida. So it's really fascinating me to follow these kids and to watch them initiating something, trying to respond. But what bothers me is that it seems like they see like these, I guess these fad social justice issues. They'll see these hashtags on Instagram, wherever they find the information, they'll want to jump on that train immediately without asking, like, what is the proposal here? How is this response really adequate? What is this response really trying to offer? So I don't know, my question is, like, first of all, I don't want to discourage my kids from getting involved in these types of social justice things, because I think it's beautiful that they are taking initiative on their own, but I do want to provoke them to look a little bit more deeply and to ask, what is this really about, and how do we face something as grave as, you know, school shootings? So, I don't know, if you can offer something for how I can talk to my students, help them to look a little bit more deeply than they usually do.
Can't get up on you.
Again, I would say, you know, and again, I applaud like the effort, you know, that these young people, they are trying to do something, you know, they are trying to do something, and they're certainly passionate. I understand what you're saying about the apathy. I think it's a shame that, you know, they've become almost desensitized. Oh, you know, that happened again, you know what I mean? Oh, another one, you know, I mean, the last I heard, there were like 167 school shootings in Sandy Hook, which is disgusting, you know, it's disgusting. But, so it has to, you know, there has to be an end to it somehow. And I do think that it's a multifaceted approach. I think for me to be brave enough to speak today, because I've been silent for 5 years, I think maybe partly that's just been my like healing process, and also partly it's my response to Parkland because, and I mean, I don't know why, you know, then the 166th time or the 165th time, you know, didn't prompt me to respond, but for whatever reason, you know, I was moved to respond in this way, but I think that just to let kids know that yes, to political activism is great and it's important, but it's a multifaceted approach. There are other things. You know, the perpetrator of Parkland also had autism. And, you know, so, and I'm not saying, you know, I mean, you know, that was something I was a little sensitive to actually right after Sandy Hook happened. You know, but, you know, and there could be many, many reasons, you know, why people become isolated and withdrawn. But I think that, you know, we could talk to kids about reaching out, you know, to their community members and looking, you know, for people who are, you know, isolated, people who are alone. You know, I mean, I'm not saying even just the special needs population. There are people who, for a variety of reasons, are alone. You know, they're lonely, they're isolated, they don't have friends, and I think we need community. You know, you know, people need people, and they need involvement. So I think maybe to prompt students to act in that way, you know, to, you know, that whole if you see something, say something. If you see someone, invite them. Yes. You know, right?
Well, I want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts to Jenny and to Dawn for coming, for sharing your lives with us, your sorrows, your hope, your faith. You have made a great impact on us and have given us a certainty that, yes, there is every reason to hope and to look for that someone and to make a difference. The evil won't win. But what you are living is a witness to us and a path for us to follow. So thank you very much. And before we conclude the evening, Rita Simmons has some remarks to make